Okay, my friends, how are you doing today? And we are going to be talking about social interaction. There are four principles of social interaction that we want to pay attention to. And sociologists tend to agree on these four, and you will see them in a variety of intro to sociology textbooks. So it should work for whichever one you're using at whatever college or university you attend. So, what the four are basically fairness, pleasure, reciprocity, and rationality. Okay? So these four principles, we'll take them in turn, are very important because they'll help you to structure your personal, educational, career, social, community types of relationships that you have. So basically, the first one, let's take fairness. In our society and in any society, people want to be treated fairly, right? I mean, if you have a pet, your pet wants to be treated fairly. Isn't that right? Isn't that right, Precious? Can you give me a kiss? Oh, look how smart you are. Okay, so people want to be treated fairly, and if you feel that you're not being treated fairly in a social situation, you can get upset or angry. Okay, so fairness, and I could go into the social psychological side and psychological side, and we can look at that from other lenses. But what we need to keep in mind is that from the general sociology sense, fairness. If you violate fairness, then people feel that something's not right. I mean, if you look at Rosa Parks, and you remember that from the bus situation, right? In Montgomery, right? She was actually already with the NAACP, and it was the third test case, if I'm not mistaken, that they were looking at. And that situation was ethically wrong, right? But it was legal at the time. And then you could see the unjustness, the unfairness of treating humans as second class. It just doesn't make sense to treat any member of our society or any place in the world people as less than. And this is actually one of the problems we have. I had a student asking about this earlier. With the systems of stratification, you have caste, class, and slavery. So the thing is, you're going to have some unfairness in any one of those systems. I mean, if you're an untouchable in the caste system, then nobody wants to touch you and nobody wants to look at you and you're less than, right? I mean, if you look at slavery, I mean, they say there are 24 million slaves right now. They have child slaves, sex slaves, all these kinds of slaves worldwide. And then, of course, in the US, we've had slavery. And just the idea of using humans as property makes no sense. I mean, but at one time in the world, I mean, it was widespread. I mean, it's just so hard to believe, right? That somebody was born into that or sold like property. Just doesn't make any sense, right? And then there's class. And then you hear how we're having this dichotomy, right? The upper class, and then we have the underclass, and we've got six classes if we want to look at Max Weber's class system. When we look at the upper class, you have the upper middle, you have the lower middle, you got the working class, working poor, and underclass, right? But that's a whole other discussion we can talk about some other time. But what you need to know is in that class system, there's going to be unfairness, right? There's going to be someone, if you look at Max Weber's idea that the upper class, and really there's the upper, and there's also an upper lower within that, but we'll just say upper class. There is that the wealth, power, and prestige. So if you have access and you're positioned well in any society and it's class-based, you're going to be set, and there's that element of fairness. The idea of socialism, communism never was achieved. Okay, that was Karl Marx's ideal. But if you think about what happened with Russia when you had the former Soviet Union, well, it was getting dismantled into 16 nations, right? What you got to keep in mind is the politicians who had the power bought the property real cheap. It wasn't pegged against the free market, and then people were waiting in the bread lines. That was unfair. So once I remember when I was young, really young, and watching that on TV, and it made an impression on me because, and this is not to say anything, I'm not judging anybody from Russia as anything other than just that fact. The politicians, doing that, some politicians, and then well, influential ones, that it kind of hurt the state of affairs for a little while because what that told me is, wow, so there isn't any political system that's totally free of any kind of fairness or unfairness issue. You see what I'm saying? So it's corruption. You're going to have corruption wherever there's corruption. And so it's independent of the political system. That's really important to know. I also heard that I read somewhere that the guy that was in Tiananmen Square, right, in 1989, do you remember that man that was standing in front of the tank? Guess what happened? From what I understand, not only was he killed, they killed. If you want to correct me on this, you can find out the research. But they erased his family's name from the register, and I heard that they killed his family members, and so that's unfair, regardless of political system, right? That issue of fairness or unfairness in social interaction, you have it at that macro level. It's not fair because if I'm going to control you and I'm in the government, then it doesn't matter what system we have. Totalitarian, right? We can look at any kind of regime, right? Every aspect of your life is being regulated. It could be more of an authoritarian socialist type, right? Or a democratic, and it all depends on the situation that you find yourself in. But on a day-to-day level, fairness, in a micro-level situation, symbolic interactionist perspective, right? We can look at that, or even a postmodern perspective, where we blend the live and online even, and look at information services and technology and look at how we interact. People want to be treated fairly. Whether online or offline, you want to be treated fairly. The second one is pleasure. Let's look at pleasure. I mean, if you look at Freud talked about pleasure versus pain, right? Sigmund Freud. And the great psychoanalyst. Isn't that right, baby? And so we're motivated as humans towards what is fun and easy. We like pleasure. And we are motivated away from pain. Now, there's a little caveat there. If we look at some defense mechanisms, and again, this is where you would really need to look into the field of psychology, you can look at a Freudian defense mechanism that's called identification with the aggressor. So the Stockholm Syndrome, if you think about that, right? There's the idea that if you're held captive and by somebody that's kidnapping you, you're going to start agreeing with some of their ideas, maybe for psychological preservation at a subconscious or unconscious level, right? And so there's this idea that now the pain becomes pleasure because you're in agreement. And it's totally survival, if you ask me. So there can be a painful situation that becomes pleasurable, but not really by that conscious level of choice. So that's what you're not going to find in the sociology textbook. It's not going to be there. But if you put that psychological piece, it kind of explains that. I think another thing that you need to keep in mind is that when I volunteered at a battered women's shelter many years ago while I was in college, just for a summer, and I wasn't allowed to counsel the women. No males were, because they were in a fragile state. And a lot of battered women get, people say, well, why do they stay in these abusive relationships? And obviously, it's also the case where men are abused, whether by other men or women. And same thing with women. Women can be abused by other women. But what's interesting is that people do it because they normalize or rationalize behavior. And that's getting us to the third principle in just a moment. So in many social interaction situations, people want to react in pleasurable ways, but if they don't see a way out, or they don't have their escape plan in the situation, or whatever the situation is, they might try to justify the pain by making it pleasurable in some sense. Even if they don't fully buy in at a conscious level, at a subconscious or unconscious level, there might be a twist that kind of keeps them in that situation. That's what's going on. Can't always know in everybody's situation, but it is kind of interesting to think about that, isn't it? And then if you have the third one is reciprocity. So what this one says is, and we'll get to rationality in a moment, but reciprocity basically says that tit for tat. I take care of you, you take care of me. I do something for you, I cover your lunch one time, you cover my lunch the next time. And and it's this give and take. And the problem is, if I keep giving, isn't that right, baby? Then what happens is you start feeling that, hey, this relationship is one-sided. It's not a balanced relationship. And really, they say in relationships, in general, you want to be a whole person and another whole person to form something better. You want to be better off and give in that relationship. Now, obviously, there are going to be some relationships where you're raising a pet or a kid or something like that, right? And it's not going to be as easy to just say, well, now, hey, where are you, when are you giving back, or how are you giving back? Not everyone's going to be giving back in the same way. And I'm also not saying that you have to keep a scorecard. What I'm saying is, it was interesting because I was just attending a Dale Carnegie training program earlier tonight, and they were talking about this idea that, if you're giving, and that idea that you want the person to also give, or you want that conversation to be both ways. And I was also talking about this in another class some time ago, the idea of the communication being, the sender and receiver are both responsible. They also hit on that earlier tonight. That idea that we're all responsible for our communication. So that's pretty important, isn't it? That idea that reciprocity. I give, you give. And we're not keeping scorecards, but we're looking, whoa, this relationship is balanced, or we feel better for being in the relationship. Obviously, it's going to depend on the situation, the circumstances, there might be slight variations on that. And then fourth is the rationality principle. Isn't that right, baby? The rationality principle says you look at the pros and cons for joining different groups, for participating in a society, and for interacting with others. What am I getting out of this? What's the benefit? You weigh the pros and cons, and what's interesting is it's tied in, it's related to the rational choice theory of deviance. If you study deviance and crime, people weigh, assuming they're rational, they're weighing the pros and cons of the situation. What am I going to get from this? I actually heard from one sociologist some time ago that in Florida, drug trafficking was at an all-time high, and then car theft started replacing that because the sentence was one-third to one-fifth of what it was for first-time offenders who were caught trafficking drugs. So what they did, the criminals shifted to car theft. Isn't that interesting? So instead of like 10 to 15-year sentences, they were getting 3 to 5. So even though the first-time offenders were getting locked up, they would be back out. So the bosses would be able to get them back out and get them to steal again. And that's rational choice theory of deviance, but that's also tied into that idea of rationality, right? But that's at a group level. But if you look at it at an individual level, what we could say is that it is quite interesting, isn't it, that you weigh the pros and cons before deciding to join a group or do something. And sometimes I want to talk about that you will do things, and then sometimes you won't know that you're getting into a situation. It turns out a particular way, and and despite your best attempts, I know a lot of personal development courses talk about this, and critical thinking, a lot of courses that tell you that, oh yes, always anticipate the worst case scenario or the outcome. You won't know based on your state of consciousness at a given point. You're doing the best that you know how. You want to consult with people that have already done something before you undertake something, but sometimes you have to just, even with your best planning, you've done all the planning, things don't always go as you anticipated, something happens, now what do you do? What kind of mental calculus are you making in that situation? Perfect example I had recently, and you might have had something similar to this. I had a situation where I had service workers in my house. There were different situations. There were a couple of times last year there was a sword I had, and then gift cards. And I suspected, based on the only situations I had, I suspected there were some people involved. Let the company know. But it's very difficult beyond that to do anything more. You can there's only so much you can do. And then I just had a situation recently with the digital camera. And I asked one of the service workers, okay, this is the situation that I'm finding myself in. And this is the situation that's interesting because that person was the only one that was in that room at that time. But again, you have to interact with people in a way that allows them to save face. Again, this is something else too that I heard earlier in the evening in the Dale Carnegie program. They were talking about this in the training group, that you are responsible for the quality of your social interaction. Do you know what I mean? It's like you have to still validate the other person and respect their feelings, even if you think that any one of those four principles is off. So I think something stinks with that. That somehow in your drawer you can have an empty camera case. When you put that item there, it was there. You put it there, it was there. It was organized. There's only one other person that was in that room, and yet you didn't see it. But you have an idea that that person was in the room, and you can't do much beyond that. What are you going to do? So you can have things like luckily I have insurance, so insurance helps. But you also have to give the person the benefit of the doubt to explain themselves in that situation. And then also you have to think from yourself, and this is where empathy is very important in these principles. If you were in that situation, how would you want to be treated? Is that making sense? You would want to be treated in a pleasurable manner. You'd want to make sure that they're making the right mental calculus, rationality. You'd want to make sure they're being fair. And you would want to be treated in a manner that you're treating them, in a reciprocal manner. Am I right? Whether we want to even say the golden rule or the platinum rule, do unto others as you want to be done unto, in the modification of that. But the point here is that, you just have to get better and at learning from life. You go through different situations, you have a lot of positive interactions. But so often our culture teaches us to notice what's wrong, or the one time or two times in the day that something goes wrong, or there might be more. But you don't have to generalize and assume that everything is going to go wrong. Or have you ever had a situation where you weren't feeling things were going well, or you tried to stay positive, something happened, you got the news about something and it was on your mind, and somebody holds the door for you? I just had something like that. It was awesome. And somebody held the door and they spent that extra second doing that. And just something small like that, even though people say, well, it's all in your head and do all of this and keep positive and move forward. I think what's really interesting is, what's powerful about that is that one person's smile, one act of kindness can totally impact all four principles of social interaction. That you might have somebody that says one compliment, and what I say to do is to really make a big deal of it. Really make a big deal. Journal about it. Write a journal and notice the positive things. Things are going to happen to you. But as you've heard, I'm sure, a million times in social interaction, that you can grow from what you've had happen. Isn't that right, baby? You can grow from what has happened, and you can move forward. And what's interesting is, in certain types of interactions, it might be painful. Some people I've had people that have had students that have had a whole variety of situations. They've had all sorts of things happen, and what I often remind them of is, obviously it doesn't replace any professional help outside of any college or university. What you want to keep in mind is that whatever you've gone through, whatever experience, whether it's loss, theft, death, divorce, any kind of situation you've gone through in a social interaction type of manner, that is gotten you to the next level. Okay? And it'll seem like times that you're backsliding. I mean, even if a student or anybody that has used drugs or something like that in the past, or anybody watching has done anything like that, you might be an effective person to counsel somebody if you ever wanted to go that route, to be a drug counselor. I wouldn't be, not having done that. So it's you also have to have that credibility from having walked there. I mean, you can be effective, in certain cases, but people are going to identify with you, interact with you in a way that is more reciprocal, for example, if they know, well, you know what it's like, you've been there before. So I think that's where the theory and the practical experiences come in together. They kind of combine, so no matter what you've gone through, you can get better. If you hadn't gone through that experience, you wouldn't be to the next level. I mean, you wouldn't get to that next level. I think that you got to look at the upsides of different things. And you don't always know why things happen. I mean, despite your best intentions, you could try to say, well, I should have known better in this situation, but you can't go back into the past. You can't interact any differently than you already have, right? You already interacted that way, so now what are you going to do? So then the question is, how do you take those 4 principles, use them in your life in a way that not only benefits yourself, but others, and then where you give them the benefit of the doubt. You're being fair. You're being pleasurable. You're being reciprocal. You're making the best mental determination in that situation and learning from it. And that could mean, you know what, I think based on what I've learned, I'm going to stop an interaction with someone. And in my situation, a couple of the ones that I mentioned earlier, I've consulted with different people about it, and it's hard to, how do you know what I mean? You want to believe the best in people. You want to trust people. You want to interact and be positive because that's maybe how you would do it, right? See, that's where you can get blinded. But then at the same time, you got to be open to what is. Okay, so this is the situation I'm finding before me. When I'm with this person, this is the result. And then you look at what you're doing to impact that interaction, okay? And if you can find a way to balance all this out and either work at the relationship or not, do I continue it or not? Family members, friends, co-workers, fellow students, right? Whatever you have, whatever situation you find yourself in, it's all about negotiating. And then also looking at what can I do to impact the quality of the social interaction. So again, notice too that it's all a matter of perspective. We change over time. We go through new life experiences. We have also hurt others, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. We don't always know what we're doing. And we got to grow from those experiences and not do certain things again. And that's really how you move forward. Sometimes it's possible to make amends. Sometimes it's not. And if it's not always possible for you to make amends to a person that has you have wronged, or vice versa, maybe the person's passed or whatever, you write a letter, you burn it. You can role play and get it out using psychological techniques like the empty chair technique or some sort of psychodrama technique, but you could also see a professional about this. And you can always practice your interactions in a group setting, in a group therapy type setting. It's very good, depending on whatever the situation is that allows you to speak of. But I think there's a lot of cleansing that has to constantly be done so that the social interactions that you find yourself in aren't blinded by your past. Is that making sense? It's so that you're not going through a situation and saying, well, every situation I've had like this is going to be, or that I'm now seeing is like that one in the past. It may be if you don't learn a lesson or move on from it. And that's actually something that's taken some work for me, and I know a lot of people may be watching this, that idea of letting go of things and leaving them at the scene. You know, at the same time, if you didn't learn anything from it, that experience, right? Maybe some experiences you won't really, you just kind of go through very quickly. But if you don't learn something in general, and it's a big, costly lesson, then you're going to repeat it again. Or maybe it'll be a modified form, you know, and it'll impact future social interactions. Or maybe you'll be blinded, you know, by it. And sometimes that's why feedback is important. We've got to get that feedback and grow and constantly push ourselves and really influence the social interactions in the way that we want to. So I know I said quite a bit there. I went into the 4 principles of social interaction: fairness, reciprocity, pleasure, okay, and rationality. So we have those 4 principles, and you have a little bit of the psychology as well thrown in for a good measure. And I hope that you could see how you could use them at a micro level and also a macro level and kind of make sense of your world, your psychological world even, and your sociological world. If you had any thoughts about what was said in this video, post it below. I can make future videos based on any kind of related topic that you would like, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.